I hope it was understandable. Basically, creation, not only was it history, but it was also prophetic in nature, in that each day of creation corresponds to 1,000 years of history. And we get that from, so when we looked at Leviticus 23 a couple weeks ago, where God told Moses, he said, speak to the people of Israel and say to them, these are the appointed feasts that you shall proclaim as holy convocations. They are my appointed feasts. You know, in other words, God was saying these are certain times throughout the year that you have to do certain things. There were seven, what they're called appointed feasts. There were 7 feasts that were to be observed every year. And we looked at those a couple weeks ago. It was Passover and unleavened bread and the Day of Atonement, those ones. Those were the 7 that they were supposed to keep, once every year. But there was also one before that we didn't look at, and that was the weekly Sabbath. And so that was an appointed time that Israel was supposed to keep every week. And it corresponded back to creation, that God created the earth in 6 days and then rested on the 7th. And so likewise, the nation of Israel, they were supposed to work for 6 days and then rest on the 7th, the Sabbath. And this is Leviticus 23 here. And we see in verse 3, it says, 6 days shall work be done, but on the 7th day is a Sabbath of solemn rest, a holy convocation. Remember, we looked at that word, and holy convocation in Hebrew, it means it's a rehearsal. So basically the Sabbath that they were supposed to observe every week, it was a rehearsal. And he says that you shall do no work. It is a Sabbath to Yahweh in all your dwelling places. And the 2 key terms there are the appointed feast or the appointed time, and then holy convocation, which basically can mean, I think in this context, it means a rehearsal. And it was a rehearsal for something. We know that because of what Jesus did. He did something on Passover and on unleavened bread and on first fruits and on the Feast of Weeks. He did something on the day. So we know that those feasts that Israel did, they were a rehearsal for something that Jesus was going to do later. And if we look back, I highlighted all the times that word appointed feast or holy convocation is used. And it's quite a bit in Leviticus 13 or 23. And so Leviticus 23, one of the books in the Bible that deals with all of the laws that, sometimes can seem like it's kind of boring. It's actually prophetic in nature. And then there's this cool video that, I'm going to make this screen bigger, that the Bible Project did that I want to check out really quick.
The number 7 is a big deal in the Bible.
Yeah, in biblical Hebrew, the word 7 is connected to the idea of fullness or completeness.
And that's something we all long for, but don't. Is a big deal in the Bible.
Yeah, in biblical Hebrew, the word 7 is connected to the idea of fullness or completeness.
And that's something we all long for, but don't often experience. Instead, we find ourselves working endlessly, fighting back chaos with no real rest.
Yes. Now keep all that in mind as we turn to Genesis 1 in the Bible. It begins with darkness and disorder, but then God speaks to bring about light and order so that life can flourish.
And this happens over the course of 6 days.
Each day is marked with the phrase, there was evening and there was morning. But on the 7th day, something special happens.
God stops and rests.
Right. Creation is brought to its completion on the 7th day. And that phrase, there was evening and there was morning, it doesn't appear on day 7.
It's like a day with no end.
On the seventh day, God's presence fills his creation. The land provides for all of God's creatures, including humans, who are appointed to rule the world with God forever.
Kings and queens of the seventh day rest. I can get into that.
But the humans are deceived by a dark power, and they forfeit that rest. They're exiled into the wilderness, where they have to work as slaves to the land.
Until they die and return to the dust from which they came.
But God wants to restore humanity back to that seventh day rest. So he chooses to give the family of Israel that experience of ultimate rest so they can share it with others.
But how? They're in Egypt, slaves to an oppressive empire who's grinding them into the dust.
So God confronts Egypt and he liberates the Israelites, taking them through the darkness and chaos on the way to the promised land.
Now, while they're on their way, they find themselves in the wilderness. It's easy to get lost, life is a struggle. They're not in the land of rest yet.
But while they're on the way, God invites them in the wilderness to start living as if they're in the promised land.
But how do you practice the future rest in the wilderness?
Well, God tells them that every seventh day they are to stop their work, or in Hebrew, to Shabbat, so that they can rest and enjoy God's good world.
So take a whole day to live as if the ultimate rest has already come.
Yeah, this is the Sabbath, celebrated every week on the seventh day. But there's more. The Sabbath is just one of 7 festivals that Israel practiced every year, each one anticipating that seventh day rest.
That is a lot of sevens.
And there's even more. Every 7 years, the Israelites were to liberate slaves, forgive debts, and let the land rest for a whole year. And then, every 7 times 7 years was the ultimate seventh day rest, called the Year of Jubilee. If anyone had lost their land or gone into debt, all was forgiven, everything restored.
Wow, so the Sabbath, these feasts, the Year of Jubilee, it's all pointing towards the hope of future rest.
Right. Now, when the Israelites went into the land, they forgot their God, and so they forfeited their chance for rest in the promised land.
They're exiled and enslaved again by an oppressive nation, led back into a world of chaos and disorder.
But Israel's prophets said that their exile would end one day, and that the ultimate jubilee of freedom and rest would come, but generations go by, and they're still waiting.
It's at this dark point in the story that Jesus appears, and he launches his public mission on a Sabbath day.
Yeah, he read aloud from the scroll of Isaiah, saying that it was time for all captives and slaves to be released because this was the year of the Lord's favor.
What did he mean, this is the year of the Lord's favor?
He was talking about the ultimate jubilee.
Also, Jesus is claiming that seventh day rest would come through him.
Right, he said that he was the Lord of the Sabbath, and he confronted disorder and darkness in all of its forms, liberating people from sickness, sin, even from death itself.
Yet, Jesus was killed, so even his work was undone.
Well, it seemed that way. But notice, Jesus timed his death to take place at the end of the week. His body rested in a tomb during the Sabbath, and on the 8th day, he rose from the dead.
Oh wait, the 8th day? You mean the first day of a new week?
Exactly. Jesus' resurrection was like the first day of a new creation, where God's light and life broke into the darkness.
So because of the resurrection, we have hope in God's promise of future rest. But we're not there yet. It's like we're still in the wilderness, where we experience struggle and pain.
But as we journey towards that ultimate seventh day, Jesus invites us to experience a taste of real rest now by following him. Or in his words, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest."
I like how they did the visuals for it, and how they talked about how, there were 6 days of creation. On the 7th, God rested. Then we see in Leviticus 23 that Moses, commands Israel that they're to work for 6 days and then rest on the 7th. And that was a part of 7 feasts that we see in Leviticus 23 that were ultimately pointing to that Sabbath. And the final feast, the Feast of Tabernacles, or the Feast of Booths, I think bears the closest resemblance to that Sabbath rest. And then they also pointed out that, every 7 years was, I think they were supposed to let the land rest. People that were slaves were to be let free. People that owed debts, they were to be forgiven. And then every, 7 times 7, every 49 years plus 1 would be a jubilee. So every 50 years, you'd have this big jubilee where all debts were forgiven, things like that. And what they didn't touch on in the video, but what I'm going to touch on today is how, there's another one of those patterns there, and it has to do with the whole of human history. I believe, and I'm going to give you the evidence here tonight that human history is going to last for 7,000 years. That it's going to be 6,000, basically where man rules, and then the final 1,000 where Jesus rules himself on the earth. And that the creation story was actually pointing toward that the whole time. That God created the earth in 6 days, rested on the seventh. Humans or man will rule on this earth for 6,000 years, but Jesus will in the 7th millennium. And I'll show you the evidence that a lot of ancient rabbis and the early church fathers believed this as well. And then we'll tie this into the book of Revelation. So if you look at Psalm 90, this is a psalm of Moses. And it says, I'll just start down in verse 3 here. It says, "You return man to dust and say, return, O children of man. For 1,000 years in your sight are but as yesterday when it is past." And so sometimes we take that and we read it and we think, that, God resides outside of time. So like 1,000 years are nothing to him. But Moses, he says that, when 1,000 years have passed, it's like yesterday to you. We see this idea in the New Testament as well. Peter talks about it in 2 Peter chapter 3. There were a lot of people going around saying, Jesus, he's not coming back. Things, they're going on like they always have been. Nothing special is going on. And he says, let's see, we'll start in verse 3 on the third line there. It says, "Knowing this, first of all, that scoffers will come in the last days with scoffing, following their own sinful desires. They will say, 'Where's the promise of his coming? For ever since the fathers fell asleep, all things are continuing as they were from the beginning of creation.' For they deliberately overlook this fact, that the heavens existed long ago, and the earth was formed out of water and through water by the word of God, and that by means of these, the world that then existed was deluged with water and perished. But by the same word, the heavens and the earth that now exist are stored up for fire, being kept until the day of judgment and destruction of the ungodly. But do not overlook this one fact, beloved, that with the Lord 1 day is as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years as 1 day. The Lord is not slow to fulfill his promise, as some count slowness, but is patient toward you, not wishing that any should perish, but that all should reach repentance. But the day of the Lord will come like a thief, and the heavens will pass away with a roar, and the heavenly bodies will be burned up and dissolved, and the earth and the works that are done on it will be exposed." So there were people saying, everything's going on the way it always has been. Jesus isn't coming back. And Peter's reminding his readers that, remember, a day until the Lord is 1,000 years. And again, we take that to mean that God exists outside of time, which he does. And that 1,000 years are just like a day to him. But my question is, did Moses and Peter, did they mean something more than that? And I think that they did, especially Peter, because he would have been familiar with a lot of what the ancient rabbis taught and what his contemporaries believed. And so I think he meant more. I think he meant more than just God resides outside of time. And we'll take a look at some of this. So that there were many in and around the time of Jesus during the Second Temple period, that a lot of people believed in a 6,000 year period of history in which man would rule the earth, but would be followed by a 1,000 year Sabbath where Jesus rules. And that's kind of looked at what the song that we listened to. It kind of laid out the whole thing for us. And so what I want to do is I want to work our way backwards from like the early church fathers, all the way back to the ancient rabbis and sages, even before the time of Jesus, that they thought this as well. So we'll start with some of the earliest sources, and then we'll work our way back. So Irenaeus, he was an early church father. He was a disciple of a guy named Polycarp, who himself was a disciple of John, who most likely wrote the book of Revelation. And John, I believe, was the disciple whom Jesus loved. So he was one of the 12. So in a sense, Irenaeus could be considered a spiritual grandson of John, who was a disciple of Jesus. And he had this to say, and this was about 150 AD. He said, "For in as many days as the world was made, in so many thousand years shall it be concluded. And for this reason, the scripture says, thus the heaven and the earth were finished in all their adornment, and God brought to a conclusion upon the sixth day the works that he had made. And God rested upon the seventh day from all his works. This is an account of the things formerly created, as also it is a prophecy of what is to come. For a day of the Lord is as 1,000 years, and in 6 days created things were completed. It is evident, therefore, that they will come to an end at the 6,000th year." And again, that was in 150 AD. So when we back up a little bit, there was a letter, the Epistle of Barnabas. It's not in the Bible. And that was written sometime after the destruction of the temple in 70 AD and 130 AD. And the Epistle of Barnabas says this. It says, "He speaks of the Sabbath at the beginning of creation, and God made in 6 days the works of his hands, and on the seventh day he made an end and rested in it and sanctified it." Notice, children, what is the meaning of he made an end in 6 days? He means this, that the Lord will make an end of everything in 6,000 years, for a day with him means 1,000 years. And he himself is my witness when he says, "Lo, the day of the Lord shall be as 1,000 years." So then, children, in 6 days, that is in 6,000 years, everything will be completed. And he rested on the seventh day. This means when the sun comes, he will destroy the time of the wicked one and will judge the godless and will change the sun and the moon and the stars. And then he will truly rest on the seventh day. There was a rabbi, and this was about 200 years before Jesus, Rabbi Elias. And this is in the Babylonian Talmud, which is it's a document with, I would say, like Jewish traditions according to the, ancient rabbis. It says this, the world endures 6,000 years. And so even before Jesus, they were breaking this 6,000 year period into different sections. So here he says in 6,000 years, 2,000 years before the law, which I think can basically mean from creation to Abraham. 2,000 years under the law, which would be from Abraham to Jesus, or Moses to Jesus. And then 2,000 years under Messiah's grace, which is 2,000 years under Jesus. Rabbi Katina, this is also in the Talmud. He said, the world endures 6,000 years, and 1,000 it shall be laid waste. That is, the enemies of God shall be laid waste. Whereof it is said, the Lord alone shall be exalted in that day. As out of 7 years, every 7th year is a year of remission. So out of 7,000 years of the world, the 7th millennium shall be the 1,000 years of remission, that God alone may be exalted in that day. So this idea was pretty common before the time of Jesus, during the time of Jesus, and even after, with the early church fathers believed this. It kind of fell out of popular thought, around the time of Augustine. But for the first, 150, maybe 300 years, this was a common belief that the earth, as we know it, would last for 6,000 years. And so keep this in mind. Keep this in mind when we read Revelation 20. So it says, then I saw an angel coming down from heaven, holding in his hand the key to the bottomless pit and a great chain. And he seized the dragon, that ancient serpent, who is the devil and Satan, and bound him for 1,000 years, and threw him into the pit and shut it and sealed it over him, so that he might not deceive the nations any longer until the 1,000 years were ended. After that, he must be released a little while. Then I saw thrones, and seated on them were those to whom the authority to judge was committed. Also, I saw the souls of those who had been beheaded for the testimony of Jesus and for the word of God, and those who had not worshipped the beast or its image, or had not received its mark on their forehead or their hands. They came to life and reigned with Christ for 1,000 years. The rest of the dead did not come to life until the 1,000 years were ended. This is the first resurrection. Blessed and holy is the one who shares in the first resurrection. Over such the second death has no power, but they will be priests of God and of Christ, and they will reign with him for 1,000 years. And then I have some quotes from a couple of studies. These are peer-reviewed, work of scholars here. This one is called The Seventh Day Sabbath and Sabbath Theology in the Book of Revelation. Let's see, it says it demonstrates how Revelation places the Sabbath in the context of the entire biblical message. And the paper starts out saying that the word Sabbath is never mentioned in the book of Revelation, but yet but you can tell it's a theme throughout the book, especially at the end, this theme of Sabbath, even though the word is not mentioned there. And in the paper, it argued that its lack of finding that actual word Sabbath in Revelation, it's almost so obvious that it's not there, that it's pointing you to the fact that that's the theme of it. It's almost like a big marker for us to see, like, everything in there seems to be talking about the Sabbath. We should get this talk of 1,000 years, but yet I feel like John is making it so obvious, and he made it so obvious by not using that word in it, if that makes sense. There's another paper I put in here, and I'll put it at the end of the study if anyone links to it, if anyone wants to read these. But this one's called The Eschatological Sabbath in John's Apocalypse, a Reconsideration. And basically what they're arguing here is that amongst the early church fathers and the ancient rabbis, there was like two beliefs. that when the Messiah would come back, that when Jesus comes back, that he's either going to usher in a Sabbath that is 1,000 years, that does follow, that time still exists, or that when Jesus comes back and ushers in the Sabbath, that it's a timeless one. And I think what the author is arguing here is that it's a timeless Sabbath, which I don't agree with, but there is some valuable stuff in this study that shows that this was the belief of a lot of church fathers and the ancients. And that's why I put it in here. Although I think sometimes it's hard to tell what scholars are actually arguing, reading their stuff. Like I have to read it like 3 or 4 times to like, what are you arguing? But I think that's what they're arguing. And so I would disagree with that, but I think it is a valuable source for like understanding that this isn't a new thing. And so when John mentions the 1,000 years in Revelation 20, did he have all of these things in mind? Did he have this idea in mind? And this leads us to a fork in the road. And when you read the Bible, you come to a lot of these. When you're reading the Bible, you come to a point where the road veers off in 2 directions and you have to make a decision, which one you're going to go down. And they both seem, both roads seem like there's good arguments for going down either road, but you got to weigh those things against each other. And whichever one tips the scales, then you kind of got to go down that. And then once you go down that path, then you'll come to another fork in the road. And that's not just dealing with this stuff with the end times. This is like the whole Bible. We were looking at Genesis 1 through 11 on Wednesday, and there are plenty of things in just Genesis, in the first 2 chapters of Genesis, that you come to a fork in the road. Like, how do we reconcile this? Like, where did Cain find his wife? Mm-hmm. It was either he married one of his sisters, or there were other humans on the earth besides Adam and Eve. And I'm leaning towards that there were other humans besides Adam and Eve. And then you get to Cain, he gets to a city. He's banished, he goes east, and then he gets to a city. Like, how is there already a city there if it was Adam and Eve and then him and his brother? Like, there are all these interpretations that, I think that's the best way to put it. It's like a fork in the road. And so here, in reading Revelation 20, we come to a fork in the road. Like, are we going to assume that John had this day as 1,000 years idea in his mind when he wrote it? I think it's possible. Actually, I think it's likely, because there are a lot of interpretations, especially with the end times regarding this 1,000-year reign of Jesus or the millennial kingdom. There's basically 4 views. There's actually like 6 main views of the end times. There's 2 of them that say everything was fulfilled by 70 AD, the book of Revelation, everything that was all fulfilled then. And that's like the preterist view, they call it. And those get separated into 2 different camps. And then among the people that say, a lot of it's future, you have what would be called like a historic premillennial position. And then you have a post-millennial position that a lot of it was fulfilled in 70 AD. And they believe that the earth is going to get better and better and better. And we're going to usher in this golden age in which Jesus comes back in. Like, the golden age is going to start here, and then Jesus is going to come back. And they say that the millennial kingdom, that's just symbolic language to depict the time between Jesus' first and his second coming. And that's the same with the amillennial position, which is another one. And it's called amillennial because they believe that there is no millennium, or that it's entirely symbolic. And they too believe that the 1,000 years that John's talking about in Revelation 20 is symbolic for the time between Jesus' first and his second coming. And then you have the dispensational premillennialist, which is probably the most common end times position people have today. And they believe that the 1,000 years is in the future and it is a literal 1,000 years, as does the historic premillennial position. And so what none of the end times position touch on, though, are the Jewish feasts. None of them talk about the Jewish feast, like what we talked about a couple weeks ago. And they don't really talk about this stuff. So my question is, especially to the post-millennial people and the amillennial folks, is that if when John used the 1,000 years, if by that he just meant a long period of time or the time between Jesus' first and second coming, why would he use that language if it would confuse many of his readers? Because a lot of his readers were familiar with the Talmud. They were familiar with what Rabbi Katina said, what Rabbi Elias said. And that's evident from what we find in Second Peter. It's from what we find. It's different from what we find in the Epistle of Barnabas, from what Irenaeus was talking about. They all believed in a literal 1,000 year reign of Jesus. But if John didn't mean that, why did he specifically say 1,000 years? That's the question. And so that's when we come to the fork in the road. And I choose to go down the road that when he said the 1,000 years, that he meant 1,000 years, because that was the common belief at the time. Here's some more evidence that this was the belief. So we look at Genesis chapter 2. God had Adam and Eve in the garden. He tells them, "You may surely eat of every tree in the garden, but of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat." And then he says, "For in the day that you eat of it, you shall surely die." But we know that when they ate of it, they didn't die. They were banished from the garden. And so we tend to spiritualize this verse, saying that, well, Adam and Eve, they died spiritually that day. And I don't think that's what it means. And it's interesting to find out that Adam lived 930 years. So if a day to God is 1,000 years, Adam living less than 1,000 years meant he died on the day he ate from the tree. And I think that's the case because Adam and Eve were supposed to live for a long, long, long time. I don't think they were supposed to die, but they ate, and then Adam died within that first day, within the first 1,000 years. He lived to 930 years old. Now, I'm not making this up. This is also found in the book of Jubilees, which is a text which is found between the two testaments. So it was written after the Old Testament, but before the New Testament. Jesus would have been familiar with this. It was written a couple hundred years before Jesus came. And it says this. It says, "And at the close of the 19th Jubilee in the 7th week, in the 6th year thereof, Adam died, and all his sons buried him in the land of creation. And he was the first to be buried in the earth, and he lacked 70 years of 1,000 years. For 1,000 years are as one day in the testimony of the heavens. And therefore it was written concerning the tree of knowledge, on the day that ye eat thereof, ye shall die. For this reason he did not complete the years of this day, for he died during it." And that's in Jubilees chapter 4, verses 29 and 30. And the book of Jubilees is like it's like a retelling of Genesis. It's like a second Genesis. And then in the New Testament, we get Hebrews chapter 1, verse 1. Long ago, at many times and in many ways, God spoke to our fathers by the prophets. But in these last days, which is the last 2,000 years, he has spoken to us by his Son, whom he has appointed the heir of all things, through whom also he created the world. So that's why in the New Testament, we get to talk of the last days, because they understood that we were living in the final 2,000 years, or the final 2 days of the present age. This is an interesting one, Hosea chapter 6. This is a prophecy. It says, "Come, let us return to the Lord." This is speaking of Israel. "For he has torn us that he may heal us. He has struck us down and he will bind us up. After 2 days, he will revive us. On the third day, he will raise us up that we may live before him." And this is speaking of the Jews presently. We know that by and large, the Jews do not accept Jesus as their Messiah. But it was prophesied in Hosea chapter 6 that that would happen. But it says that after 2 days, he's going to revive them. That is, after 2,000 years, he's going to revive them. And then on the third day, or at the start of the millennial reign, he's going to raise them up. And then we see this happening in Zechariah chapter 12. In Zechariah chapter 12 through 14 is like a end times passage that is often overlooked for some reason. I don't know why, but you get passages like Zechariah 12 through 14, Ezekiel 38 and 39, Isaiah 36, Jeremiah 32, of course, Revelation 20. They're all describing the same time period. And here it says, "And I will pour out on the house of David and the inhabitants of Jerusalem a spirit of grace and pleas for mercy, so that when they look on me, on him whom they have pierced, they shall mourn for him as one mourns for an only child, and weep bitterly over him as one weeps over a firstborn. On that day, the mourning in Jerusalem will be as great as the mourning for Hadad Rimmon in the plain of Megiddo. The land shall mourn, each family by itself, the family of the house of David by itself, and their wives by themselves, the family of the house of Nathan by itself, and their wives by themselves." And then it goes on to say that they basically, that God's going to pour out a spirit of grace and supplication on the nation of Israel, on the Jews. And it's interesting that it mentions here the house of David and the house of Nathan. And if you remember when we looked at Jesus's genealogy, that his biological genealogy goes through David's son Nathan and not Solomon, which is interesting. I don't know exactly what that means, but it's interesting nonetheless. And this parallels Romans chapter 11, where Paul talks about the Jews. One day they're going to see Jesus, that he is their Messiah. We know that Jesus was born. We talked about this around Christmas time, that Jesus was born in 3 BC. And the gospel, according to Luke, tells us that Jesus was about 30 years of age when he started his ministry. And most scholars believe his ministry lasted for about 3.5 years. So we can say that Jesus probably died somewhere around 30 AD. And so if you take 30 AD and add 2,000 years, what year do you get? You get the year 2030, which is 9 years away. And so I'm not saying that Jesus is going to come back in the year 2030. That's not what I'm saying, just in case. I got to make that very clear. I'm not saying Jesus is coming back in the year 2030, but I am saying this. If he did come back in the year 2030, I wouldn't be surprised. We have the evidence for it. But I also wouldn't be surprised if he came back in 2060 or 2070 or 2100. It wouldn't surprise me. But I'm open to the idea that, yeah, it's going to be exactly 2,000 years in about 9 or 10 years. So no matter which way you cut it, no matter how you do the math, like the song said, we're living in the final seconds of the 6th day. Like we're on the precipice of the 7th day of the Sabbath rest of the 1,000 years. And that should be encouraging to us, that we could possibly be like the generation that sees Jesus come back. And like we have, like, I'm not saying he's going to, like, if by 2,000 years he meant like 2,070 years or 2,100 years, it would be about 2,000 years, So I wouldn't be surprised if he didn't come back for another 50 or 100 years. Like, that still fits with what we're talking about here. But at the same time, we kind of got to be like the Magi or the wise men. They understood the time that they were in too. Herod summoned them and asked, was the king of the Jews born? Is he supposed to be here at this time? And the Magi were probably like, yeah, based off of all the things that we've studied, it's about time that he should be here. And I think we should look at these things and think, like, based off of all of this, like, we are close, no doubt. But we can't say for certain, when it's going to happen. And so again, I'm not saying that Jesus is coming back in 2030. I'm not saying that. I think that would be too simple.
How old will you be by then, Scott?
Like 42.
Well, Robin, you will have to experience resurrection then.
Yeah.
And me, I mean, 30 years, I would be 92. That is
in 30 years, I'll be like 60 something. I might still be alive.
I will have a long shot. Yeah. I think the point really is it can happen anytime, I mean, Scott, wait a minute. We are not sure even of the 30 years, I mean, because we know, I mean, there is always give and take, 5-10 years.
Yeah.
In the calculations.
Yeah.
But
maybe the time started with the destruction of the temple, maybe.
It could be.
Maybe the 2,000 years will be in 2070. Who knows?
So we are in the period that really it can happen anytime, any moment. We could have 30 years, we could have less than that. And that means that we really have to be careful how we live right now, because eternity could come at any given moment. And this study has just actually supported, reinforced what we have been talking when we talk about the revelations. And it's amazing, because it is only now that I learned that the Sabbath itself, the 7 days, the 6 days creation, and in the 7th day as the Sabbath, is actually a blueprint of God's setting up the history. And also, thank you for mentioning about Adam, that the reinterpretation of on the day that you shall eat of it, you shall die, because that really coincides with the idea that he died on the same day, which is 1,000-year length of a day.
And that was stuff that dates back to the time before Jesus. And so if these rabbis were here, or if the early church fathers were here, they would say, we're right at the time when Jesus is supposed to come back, based off of what they believed. And I think, we get that from Irenaeus, who was a disciple of Polycarp, who was a disciple of John, the guy who wrote the book. They believed this. And if they were here today, they would tell us we're at that 2000 year. We're coming towards the end of that 2000 years of Messiah.
You mentioned Augustine, and I think
Mhm.
the thing is, Augustine is actually off when it comes to so many about the end times, about the doctrines, of the last days
Yep.
and of the
Like this.
church. So, but he's the one who's got the loudest voice in the church.
Yeah.
And I mean, the Catholic Church has basically established, built their doctrines on his teaching.
Hmm.
And sad to say, because as Christians are following the same. Um, Good for you to mention Irenaeus, um, because between the two, it should be Irenaeus as a theologian we should follow and we should study.
Hmm. Yep. And so like a lot of things fell out of like the book of Enoch
Mm.
kind of fell out of what do I want to say? Like it wasn't as common during the time of Augustine as it was before. So like the book of Enoch fell out of favor. This idea of the 6,000 year period of human history kind of fell out of favor within the church. And Augustine, he was such a large figure, and he came out of a group, I think, or like a sect
Yep.
that upheld the book of Enoch. And so him battling them caused him to reject the book of Enoch and probably reject this type of end times thinking too. And it's too bad.
It
And so,
and it this explanation actually supports the young Earth theory.
mhm,
So we don't calculate civilization in terms of millions of years.
yeah,
This is a
yep,
young Earth.
hmm yep, it is. It's a young earth. And if you read based off of the Bible, it's about 6,000 years old right now.
Yep.
And it's been 2,000 years since Jesus. So it's like kind of all adding up.
Okay. Thank you, Scott. And
Yep.
we expect a second load, a part two of this.
Yeah. Maybe even a part 3.
Part three, good. Okay.
Yeah. I want to talk about,